Welcome back to Visualizing Abolition, our almost weekly series of events created in partnership with the San Jose Museum of Art and the Mary Porter Cesman Art Gallery. I'm Rachel Nelson, the director of the Institute of the Arts and Sciences at UC Santa Cruz. Together with Gina Dent, professor of feminist studies, who will join us in a moment, we've considered art, music, visual culture, and the radical imaginary within abolitionist methodologies. The previous events in the series, from our first conversation with Angela Davis in October to last week's conversation with Kelly Lytle Hernandez, Joanne Barker, and Maria Gaspar, can all be found archived at barringfreedom.org, where information can also be found about the related art exhibition from which this series springs, Barring Freedom at San Jose Museum of Art, which has been temporarily closed due to the pandemic, but will be opening again in the coming days. So stay tuned for announcements about that. I also want to say it's Angela's birthday today, and we send her a huge happy birthday. So as I've said before, and it bears repeating, abolitionist approaches to social change emphasize always collaboration and partnership. And we're grateful to our many partners and collaborators who are thinking with us over the course of these months about how to create and sustain these critical discussions, including Jennifer Gonzalez, IAS faculty co-director, Alexandra Moore, co-curator of Barring Freedom, Lauren Dickens at San Jose Museum of Art, Shelby Graham and Louise Leong at the Mary Porter Cesman Gallery, Tim Young, our collaborator in San Quentin State Prison, all the artists in the exhibition, all the speakers in this series, and of course our music curator, the amazing Grammy Award-winning Terry Lynn Carrington. Today's event continues in the spirit of collaboration, with the IAS working with the Humanities Institute to host poet and memorist Reginald Dwayne Betts for a conversation with social psychologist Craig Haney, bringing together the Visualizing Abolition series with the Humanities Institute's year-long initiative on memory. I'd like to thank Nathaniel Deutsch, Irena Pollack, Saskia Nonnenberg-Dunkel, and Jessica Guild for their thoughtful partnership. There are many more people I could thank and do know I'm grateful, but I'm eager to get to today's program, which features not only the conversation with Reginald Dwayne Betts and Craig Haney, but also a new video for Music for Abolition by Malcolm Jamal Warner. That will premiere at the end of the event, and Gina will introduce it more fully. But for now, I'll turn to brief introductions of our speakers and invite Dwayne, Craig, and Gina to join me. Hi, Gina. You're muted. I'll go ahead and start the introductions. Reginald Dwayne Betts is an American poet, memorist, and teacher. His work in public defense, his years of advocacy, and his experiences as a teenager in maximum security prisons, combined with his writings and commitments to the arts, make him uniquely positioned to speak across the issues we wish to highlight in this series. His work emphasizes both the stark failures of the US criminal justice system and the roles of art and culture in promoting ideas for change. His collaboration with visual artist Titus Kaphar and the Redaction Project, a series of prints featuring poetry by Betts crafted out of legal documents, overlaid on Kaphar's etched portraits of incarcerated individuals, is featured in the Barring Freedom exhibition. In conversation with Dwayne today is Craig Haney, Distinguished Professor of Psychology at University of California, Santa Cruz. Craig's work on the study of capital punishment and the psychological impacts of imprisonment and prison isolation has resulted in numerous books and research and law review articles. His work as an expert witness establishing the unconstitutionality of conditions of confinement has given him rare access to numerous prisons, jails, and solitary confinement units across the country. His research and testimony have been cited in a number of landmark legal cases that changed individual prisons, prison systems, and correctional practices. I'm so glad to have you all join us today, and I'll turn it over to Gina now, who will moderate the conversation. If you have any questions for those of you who've joined us today, enter them into the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, and Gina will incorporate them as many as possible into the discussion. So thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Rachel. And here we are again. As the world turns around us and so much is changing, and this is a dramatic time for what some of us are calling this abolitionist present, I'm so pleased to have the two of you with us. And I know that you probably have many fans already on our Zoom today, but I'm inspired by introducing another art form into our conversation, introducing poetry. and also by broadening our conversation into the field of social psychology. And also, of course, both of you are engaged in legal work, and I want to think about that with you together as well. We also, for reasons that are probably obvious, don't have currently incarcerated people participating as much in this process as we would like. And certainly not many formerly incarcerated people are on our screens. So it's a rare privilege to be able to hear from someone who has not only survived that, but who has written profoundly about it and is willing to share that with us and is also willing to help us envision abolition. So thanks to both of you. It's going to be an exciting evening, I know. I'd like actually to turn to you, Craig. I know both of you have a little bit to share to start. And I'd just like to ask you, after your many decades of work on not only solitary confinement, but the death penalty and conditions inside, and all the work that you've done where you've had a very particular kind of access, to just share with us a little about what it means to think about that work and reflect on it in the context of today.
Well, thank you, first of all, Gina and Rachel, also for the invitation to share the floor today with you, Gina, and with Dwayne. It's an honor to be here and an honor to engage in this conversation with the two of you. I have been inside many of the nation's worst prisons over the last. Am I getting an echo? Is that coming? I don't know. Yeah. I think we may have it under control now. Does that sound better?
Yes.
Okay. Apologize for that. What that was about. The last several decades, the era of mass incarceration in the United States is an era that, for better or worse, I've borne witness to. Oftentimes forced by judges to allow my access, prison systems that didn't want to grant access to me or anyone else from the outside whose job it was to document the pain and trauma that was taking place inside these institutions. The goal always is to try to understand what's happening to people, how they're being affected by it, and to take those messages to the public, to take them to academic environments, and also oftentimes to take them to courts, so that people in authority can attempt to make a difference, attempt to minimize the number of people who are exposed to these horrible places, and in some instances to drastically reduce the population, either of prisons or prison systems, including solitary confinement units. These are, frankly, they continue to be ugly places, places of pain, places where people suffer. And in that context, it seems odd to have a conversation about prison and poetics, because in a certain sense, there is nothing at all poetry-like about prison. But there actually is a poetics to survival in prison. And this is one of the things I've learned over the many years of doing this kind of work, that the creativity, the genius really, is not in the prison form, but it's in the strategies of survival that people learn to devise, that oftentimes involves the exercise of their imagination, their creativity, their poetry in a conventional sense, or poetry in an unconventional sense of the imaginary of being in someplace else while you were confined inside one of the most restrictive environments in our society. And so I'm looking forward to the conversation with you, Gina and Dwayne, about these kinds of poetics and about the logic of survival in these otherwise extraordinarily painful, restrictive places.
Thank you, Craig. And Dwayne, I'd like to turn to you now to share with us some of your work and your thinking. Muted.
Yeah, I'm gonna think about the best way to set this up. I think I'll say it's kind of a pleasure to be here. You know, it's strange thing. It's Angela Davis's birthday, which is not a strange thing. That's a beautiful thing. But to be having this conversation on this box is strange, and also to be having this conversation that this is a story that essentially like it's a story of my life. Getting locked up at 16, and I first started studying and thinking about prison. The first piece I got published was a argument against trying juveniles as adults that I wrote while I was locked up, having been tried and incarcerated for a crime I committed when I was a juvenile. And one of the interesting things about it is you say that this question of is prison a place where poetry can be born? And first poet that I read that really hit me to this notion that I could be a poet was Etheridge Knight, and of course that was somebody who had essentially become a poet in prison, and so maybe my ambition was sort of shaped by that notion. But interestingly enough, prison is a hard place to be a poet, but so is law school. And the thing that drove me to law school, I just give a little bit of backstory before I read this piece, is I couldn't get a fucking job. You know what I mean? I had like an AA, I had a BA, I had an MFA, I had a fellowship at Harvard. I was like, killing, I thought, the professional space. And I remember the last job I applied for, they said they were inventing new ways to tell me no. And so this was a job in a sort of impoverished kind of community, working at a community center teaching kids. And they was like, well, we would love to hire you, and it's not your felonies. It's just that you sound so much like a professor. And that was like new to me, that I couldn't get a job because I sounded too educated to work with poor black kids with my felonies. They was like, in your felonies, that's not the issue, but you sound so articulate. And so I was like, fuck it, I'm going to law school. And the thing about law school is like, my first day, this cat tells me, my professor, he says, law school is the place where poets go to die. And I thought that since I was the only poet in the room, he had to be talking to me, right? And what hit me was that I had entered a landscape where my primary concern was keeping people out of prison. And then immediately my concern was getting people out of prison, and people that I knew out of prison. But it was something about the language of law that seemed to be terrifyingly constraining. um, the whole practice of law, the whole lie that was the practice of law, both in terms of the work that a criminal defendant, defense attorney did, but the work that a prosecutor did, the work that everybody did who understood what habeas corpus meant. And I ran into these lawsuits, and the lawsuits were somebody was suing Civil Rights Corps. They were suing cities because they were locking people up because they couldn't pay bail. And I thought this was profound. This is like somehow a true exemplar of democracy when you could take your city to court and say you violate my constitution. But like, what does that mean if you produce an 80-page document that you need 3 years of legal training just to be able to sift through and then could barely understand? And so I took, one of the things I did in the book Felon was I took these documents, these lawsuits, 60 pages, 80 pages, 100 pages, and I broke them down and I sort of redacted them till you only had what I thought mattered, which was quintessentially um, the poem and the essence of it. And so I'm gonna share one of these with y'all because I think this was one, my first attempt to make poetry out of the law, but two, my first real understanding of the ability for the world of art to be manifest out of the jargon of law and the tools that really lead to incarceration. So let me share my screen here, and I shall read you this poem. In Missouri, the people versus the city of Ferguson. The plaintiffs, people jailed by the city. The city kept a human in its jail. The person pleaded poverty, held indefinitely, threatened, abused, left to languish. Frightened family members could buy their freedom. Impoverished cannot endure grotesque treatment. Overcrowded cells, denied toothbrushes, toothpaste, soap, subjected to the stench of excrement and refuse. surrounded by walls smeared with mucus and blood. For days and weeks, bodies cover the entire cell floor. Untreated illnesses, infections, and open wounds. Days, weeks, filthy bodies huddle in cold, a single thin blanket. They lose weight. They suffer. They must listen to the screams. They sit without natural light. When they will be allowed to leave.
Mm. Thank you. Well, you just said that you made poetry out of the law and the law into poetry. And I'd like to hear a little bit more about that, about, what it means to um, think, there's a whole field actually that I partly come from, a field called law and literature. There are journals about this. There are lots of ways that people are trying to think about what some of the ways that aesthetic education helps us to understand legal thinking and legal reasoning and legal history. But I think what you're talking about is something different, and I'd like to talk a little bit more about it, and also perhaps to think about the visuality of your poetry here in the redactions and what that means to you. Could you say a little bit more?
Yeah, I think it's two pieces though. I think about Etheridge Knight, for instance, and it's always two or three or four conversations that we're having. The first poem I read by him was for Freckle Faced Gerald. And it fucked me up because I was like 16, 17 in solitary confinement. And I'm reading about this kid named Gerald who got locked up, who was, 16. And and the poem ends up both describing this kid being raped in prison, but it also describes the way in which the system was um, the story. And the arc of the system was one that refused to protect somebody who was inside and made it look like the suffering was all in his hands. And the interesting thing is I read the poem when I was 16, imagining that 1996 my cohort of dudes that I went inside with, that we were the first to essentially be sent to prison with adults. And that poem is the thing that made me realize otherwise, right? And so I thought, oh, in a poem you could capture something of history, and you could capture something of create something of a critique of a system, and you could do it and you can make it swing and you can make it musical. And so I guess for me, part of what I'm doing is an extension of that. How do I have a sort of robust conversation through literature about the system, and to concede that it's people who do analysis better than me. It's people who do critique better than me. But to say that what I'm trying to do, like when I read that poem, it touched something inside of me. When you read a poem about a man saying he put the pictures of 46 people on his wall, and that they gave him solitude thinking about those that he missed, and you realize that now they don't let you have pictures in many prisons across the country, that they have stripped the ability to just have that one tangible marker that somebody loves you, that they mail in with a note written in a lover's handprint or some child's cursive. Like that's not even a possibility. Now, trying to convey that in an article in a piece of scholarship is cool, but I just kind of feel like to convey that through art, saying something different. And so for me, my approach has always been as a writer, I think, to get to the gut of it all, and to articulate something that speaks for maybe for myself and sometimes for folks who can't speak. And then in terms of work that me and Titus did together, one of the things was, me and him are friends, and we both, live in New Haven, and we have been talking a lot, just as dudes who know each other. And I respected his art and he respected my art. But the question was, is it possible to make the two things be in conversation? And he had long believed that the mugshot was a way in which we tried to like delegitimize the humanity of people who have been through the system. You got the state number, you got the mugshot, you got the word felon. All of this is of a kind that's trying to destabilize the humanity and disrupt the dignity of folks who carry it that way. And so we wanted to do etchings, portraits of people who have been represented in these cases to get them voice. And then it was like a thing though, like you also want to give them privacy. So he created these beautiful etchings, and then we double dropped the etchings so that for you to really see somebody and even recognize that it's two people, you got to look closely at it. Because one of the things that the mugshot does is give you permission not to look closely. And so it was this notion that even the poems as legal documents, like the legal document says something, but the legalese gave you permission not to look closely at the suffering it actually described. And the wild thing about it is if you go to a court and you hear these things argued, they will argue some like bullshit technical point about subsection 123 footnote 7, and you'll hear it for an hour and say, like, nobody said JoJo's name. And I actually read the brief, and I know the brief talked about the fact that JoJo got locked up because he couldn't pay $1,500 in traffic tickets. And why is this whole case being decided on a subsection of a law that nobody ever read? And so when I was stripping everything away from the lawsuit, I was trying to make it clear by stripping those things away to make you notice that what undergird it and what undergirds all of this is the suffering that's in plain sight. Um, when will they be allowed to leave is a kind of eternal question that we're forced to ask when we think about the system. And so I think art makes that question more visceral, and matching the voice is making that plaintive cry with the images that Titus etched, I think, creates a whole of a person. It's like, this is us, this is not, you know, this is not a whatever insult I might give to the people who talk I disagree with. This is different from that. This is somebody trying to, make it shake out right.
Thank you so much. I just for our audience, I want to say you were referring to Titus Kaphar, and the two of you have some pieces in the show that is the foundation for this series of conversations called Barring Freedom. And fortunately, in the brief window when it was open before, I was able to see them, and they are very powerful, just as your reading was today. And you're really underscoring so much of why Rachel and I wanted to do this series, and why we feel this work is so necessary. As someone myself who's spent a lot of time reading a lot of legal documents and a lot of legal theory, you realize also the way that even my own exposure to that over and over again makes it impossible sometimes to realize how other people are being affected by it. And I notice that in the classroom. I notice that when I'm speaking and I'm talking about these issues and cases, that there are ways that it's almost impossible to see deeply and to think deeply again. I wonder, Craig, for you, since it's been much of your life's work dealing with the law, and I know that you have had experiences of people you've worked with needing to use and finding ways to use arts, as you pointed out in the beginning, for their survival. I wonder if you wanted to respond also to thinking about law in this way.
Sure. Well, I have to tell Dwayne, I as I'm listening to him talk, and I'm listening to his poetry, some of which I've already read. I'm not sure whether it was a greater achievement for him to be able to nourish and develop his creative genius in prison, or to maintain it in law school. both, both things required Herculean efforts. You raised the question indirectly, whether the law is sometimes, or maybe even most of the time, part of the problem and not the solution. That those of us who use the law or try to use the law in order to break down the barriers that the criminal justice system creates, oftentimes feel the bonds of the law. The laws are a vehicle, and it's useful in certain circumstances, but it's inherently limited. And I think you've just brilliantly pointed out some of the ways in which those inherent limitations cabin our creativity or our imagination, our ability to think beyond what's in front of us. So the barriers that we work against in law using legal techniques are the things that are in front of us, and the categories of the law really don't let us often, or maybe at all, transcend those things that are in front of us. So the law defines the problem for us and it limits us in our solution. And what you just did in the last 10 or 15 minutes was show us how important it is to think beyond the bounds of the law, beyond the bounds of the categories that we've been given, and really to imagine something fundamentally different, to visualize something fundamentally different. And I don't think that imagination or that kind of visualization comes out of the law. As useful as it is under certain circumstances, it really is poetry and art that takes us to another place. And in this system, the criminal justice system, I think oftentimes taking us to another place is exactly where we need our mind to go.
No, I think we all know, but I'll just say it to be clear, that we don't want to be sending people to prison just because we want them to become poets. We don't want to be sending people to prison to be educated, but it is profoundly important to think about the reasons that people don't have access to good educations, critical educations, to resources that could allow people to use their creativity that they're of course born with, and that gets suppressed. And so I wonder, Dwayne, after reading your memoir and reading your work, if you'd want to talk a little bit to the audience about, first of all, what you experienced of education before you went inside, and then how you were able to turn that around. And you talked about Etheridge Knight inspiring you, but I know there were other inspirations.
Yeah, I told somebody, this is not funny, but I told somebody, I said, I hate to admit this to you, but I didn't commit the crime I was convicted of. No, the thing is, like, I came from a family where nobody had gone to college before, and I understood you needed a story, and so the police was looking for somebody, and they picked me up, and I just went ahead and confessed, and I felt like if I survived prison, I would come out with a story, and if I could like use that story to turn it into something that's hopeful, I could like build a life, and like it would matter. And I looked at the person, and they believed me, right? And what was devastating to me is that in their own mind, they could believe that somebody's freedom and community is so bankrupt, right? Provides so little that a kid could decide to tell a story about freedom that begins with choosing to go to prison. Like I was just thinking to myself, Jesus, I was joking. I thought it was a bad joke. And I was laughing, but you were rolling with it. What might I say that you would still believe? And this is why I mentioned that story, because as a high school kid, I was pretty smart. I read Evelyn Wood's Guide to Speed Reading as a 15-year-old, checked it out from the library. You know what I mean? Like my first internet search back in 1995 was like speed reading. You know what I mean? Like I was reading Mama Day, Wake of the Wind, Things Fall Apart. I was imagining that it was a possibility outside of my community for myself, but had no real way to articulate that, right? 11th grader, hadn't had anybody talk to me about college, didn't know what that meant. And I, stepped out there and got caught up carjacking somebody and went to prison. But I say that though to say that like the first people who actually believed, who called me like professor, who called me lawyer, who like really believed in my education on some fucking visceral fundamental level were dudes that I met in prison. I'm reading Fanon and they like, yeah, that's some good shit, man. You know what I mean? It's like a whole like different world, different landscape than I had met as a child. And I would say that like I don't know, for me, education or in prison was first like I don't want to romanticize it. Like prison was vicious and brutal, and we were cruel, and we did things to each other that like I regret, and folks suffered. Um, but at the same time, Craig said this. Sometimes the only art you have is survival, and I think to a person, people understood something of what education can do to lead to survival. Um, yeah, people will be dumbfounded that I'm even having this conversation. They would be dumbfounded because they didn't expect me to go to law school. They didn't expect me to go to college, but they asserted the validity of all of these things by how dudes engage with me, and And yeah, man, my education was mostly was mostly trying to get by. Was mostly like really trying to figure out how to move from one day to the next. Was picking up skills and tools not because I thought it was leading to a future that I could name or define, but it was just making the present a little bit easier to deal with. And you do that again and again and again, and one day you wake up and you got, enough to get you through a community college, and then you got enough to get you through University of Maryland, and on and on and on. So I'm really grateful. But next go around, I'll tell you why I'm really grateful though, because one of the things about this is that we tell the story about one person, and it ain't really about me. It feels like that sometimes, but I mean, I got letters right here. I don't even know these folks. Letters from West Virginia. People locked up in West Virginia sending me letters. I got stacks of letters. Some kid from Wyoming was like, uh, Mr. Betts, I'm so surprised, but I read your book and it really made me understand something about myself. What is white kid in Wyoming doing reading my book, telling me it makes them understand something about myself? The deprivation of prison cuts through some of the things that separated so much on the outside. Um, so yeah, I don't know. It was about finding a way to cut through that thing on the outside that told you that you wasn't enough. That's what prison was, and that's why that kid in Wyoming, it's like this black dude wrote this poem, and they're like, "Yo, this makes me see myself." It's an absurdity, you know what I mean? But this little white girl, she's like, "This poem makes me see myself," and it's power in that, and that's the kind of power in that because mainly because we refuse to allow it to exist on the outside. And I think that's what my education was, finding strength in absurdity.
So imagine if we lived in a world where people didn't have to go through that kind of trauma and pain and deal with that kind of survival in order to exercise those skills, in order to nourish that talent. The kind of things you encountered. Um, Gina knows his story, but we had an event a couple of years ago on campus, and we brought two surviving members of the Angola 3 to campus, and Angela was part of the conversation that we had with them. And the Angola 3 are, a perfect example of what Dwayne's alluding to. I mean, you're talking about extraordinarily talented people. All three of these men were joined not only by virtue of being in solitary confinement in Angola prison for decades, but they were also joined by similar life histories. They grew up poor, they grew up marginalized on the streets of New Orleans, where uh, they weren't being educated, they were being neglected by the school system. They end up being put on a pathway in the juvenile justice system to Angola. They get there with barely able to read or write, and they have to struggle in order to survive. And fortunately, they meet each other and educate each other in that environment, and end up becoming a political force for good. But imagine if that talent could have been nurtured. Imagine if that education could have been something that was available to them before all that trauma and before all that pain and before all those decades in solitary confinement. Imagine how much additional good they could have done in the world. And of course, there are examples of tens of thousands of people with life stories exactly like that, and whose talents we've suppressed, and so many of them we've picked up and put into these kinds of environments where, yes, they survive, and yes, they're tested by the challenges that they confront. But the three of us know there's a better way, and we have to visualize that better way, and we have to do what we can to move to it.
Yeah, and everybody doesn't survive. I mean, and shit, even the people who survive, I don't know, it's like you see it. Yeah, everybody doesn't survive. And even those of us who come home, you come home with a long memory.
That's right. And of course, there are many tactics used inside to prevent people from becoming exactly what you've become. And I'm talking to Dwayne, and I think we should talk a little bit about that. And I'd like to have you, Craig, talk about that in response, but in the context also of the international context that you know a lot about. I mean, in other words, these are choices we're making as a society about how to do this. And I think sometimes we don't get presented with other choices. And it would be important to talk about that as well.
Well, yeah, these are choices. We've made them. We've made bad choices. The criminal justice system likes to talk about choices at an individual level, as though crime is just about making bad choices when everybody has a free and unencumbered set of options that they could pick from. And for some strange reason, some folks just pick the bad option. And we know it's much more complicated than that. And those options are nowhere near as neatly arrayed in people's life space. But we as a society have made a lot of bad choices. And I think maybe we're beginning now to start to take responsibility for them. But for the last 40 years, we've made bad choices about prison policy. We put more people in prison for longer periods of time than any other nation on earth. So as many of the people who are tuned into this, I'm sure know, the United States has about 4 or 5% of the world's population and about 25% of its prison population. And that's a result of bad choices that we've made. We didn't have to do it this way. Other nations didn't do it this way. Other nations 30 or 40 years ago, when we were moving down this path and never turned back from it, were doing things differently. And so I've had an opportunity to look at some of those other systems in Norway and Germany and in the Netherlands, where they've looked in a fundamentally different way at people who get involved in criminal activity, see them as members of the community at the time they commit crimes, and members who are going to rejoin that community. And then the question becomes, what good things can we do for them? Not what bad things can we do to them, but what good things can we do for them to maximize their chances once they return to the community, or ideally never leave the community in the first place. And that really is visualizing abolition in a way. It's visualizing a fundamentally different way of doing these things. And it is difficult in the United States, given how little we think creatively and imaginatively about a fundamentally different way of approaching these kinds of issues and problems, something that other nations are light years ahead of us in doing.
Yes, which also connects to, well, the understood, I think, amongst prison abolitionists, the understanding that international community has declared that you're supposed to be sent to prison as your punishment, not for punishment. And yet, in US prisons at least, and of course we could talk about this around the globe, but for right now, in US prisons, it is very clear that punishment extends into the prison in such severe ways that even getting access to the kinds of materials that would allow you to read is difficult. And of course, that is exacerbated in conditions of administrative segregation or solitary confinement. Could we just talk for a little bit about, first of all, Dwayne, how do you get access to books? I think people need to understand, like, you're not being given courses that are allowing you to do this. So what are you doing?
The first that Black Poets, the night book I got, because I'm gonna tell a different story actually. I'm gonna tell a dark story, but I want to tell a story about hope and possibility, right? So I'm a young kid. I'm like 16. I'm just on the yard, and you could order books. So the first thing I started doing is like buying books, and you could buy books from Third World Press. You could buy books from the outside publishers, the vendors that folks knew about, and I knew about two: Third World Press and African World Books, and also Edward R. Hamilton. But I didn't know about Edward R. Hamilton at first. And so I'm in line to get some books that I picked up. And I see this black dude, right? And he's reading his book. I'm like, yo, can I see what you're reading? So young, I think I could just mind somebody else's business, right? So he give me the book. It's like, oh shit, this joint in this another language. Is this Spanish? He's like, yeah. I was like, oh shit, where your mom from? Norfolk. Why you ask me that? Oh, oh, where your pops from? My pops from Norfolk too. Oh shit. So they Spanish? He was like, do I look Spanish? And it was this black dude. And I was like, nah, but the book is in Spanish. It was a novel. It's like, 100 Years of Solitude or something. And I'm like, how you read this book? And he was like, well, I taught myself Spanish. That's how I read the book. And And he told me that he got the book in Edward R. Hamilton, like a sort of, textbook, and that he started learning Spanish because he couldn't think of anything else to do with his time. And so he started learning Spanish, and he built up his skills to the point that like he could read complex novels in Spanish. And I remember being in line and having this dude tell me this and just thinking, damn, it is like a huge sense of possibility amidst all this chaos. And I felt good, you know. And like 2 weeks later, I was in a hole for 6 months for some random BS that I ain't really do. And then I didn't feel good anymore. And in the whole at this prison anyway, they didn't have a library, so it really didn't matter. And folks had books, but they had books because they bought them from property and they exchanged it with each other. And I was in a hole when books were contraband. And so you would sort of get a book just by shouting out on the hall, somebody send me a book, and folks would send you books. And it's straight happenstance. I call out for a book and somebody sends me the Black Poets. It's crazy. They could have sent me anything. If they would send me anything else, I might not be having this conversation with you right now. And so that's how we got books. We built libraries amongst each other. And from prison to prison, that became just a mode of behavior. For me, I spent a lot of, I worked. I got my receipt in here somewhere. I'm gonna find it. Just I ain't gotta find it. I'm just gonna grab it because I know exactly where it is. But it's crazy because people don't get it. You work in prison, you work for 35 cents, 23 cents an hour was my first job. The height of my pay when I became a top-notch emeritus status employee, I was pulling in 45 cents an hour. But this is the receipt I came home with. And you can't see it that well. It's like $25.71, which like represents, 100 hours of work. And I would work cleaning floors first, then in the kitchen, you know, then as a GED tutor, then as a law clerk. But I would work and I would buy books. And sometimes I exploited dudes around me. I've sold tobacco, got to the point where tobacco was illegal. So sometimes a CO would hit us off with a bag of tobacco. Um, I'd be sending tobacco to the hole. You got a bag of tobacco cost $7. I'm selling the bag for $100, completely exploiting the people around me to buy books. It's a fucking shameful shit. You know what I mean? I could name Inazaki Shange, Wanda. I bought some great work um, on the addiction of the people around me. And so the point is, you make do. And sometimes you make do by contributing to the suffering of other folks. And you got to wear that too.
Mm.
I want to just go back and underscore something Dwayne said. He said I was in the hole and books were contraband. He went by that very quickly, matter of factly, because you get used to that. I've often thought that if they could make knowledge contraband in prison, they would. But that's a little harder to make contraband. So they sort of tolerate prisoners educating themselves despite the obstacles, despite the roadblocks that they put in front of them. But at any opportunity, like when they send you to the hole, and what better thing to do when you're in the hole than read books, right? You got nothing, you literally have nothing else to do. And of course, that's where they take your books away. So the logic of these places is cruel and it's destructive. And I think it's important for us to keep that in mind.
But I 100% agree. But I don't remember, like when I was 16, I went to prison. Vibe was doing stories about the legitimacy of sending 15-year-olds to prison. So was the source. Russ Parr Morning Show, which is in DC. I fucked around and had a soda can that I split up to get the station, and I'm listening to it. And this black dude is talking about how, like, whether or not they should have Pell Grants in prison. And him and all of the local callers are saying no. Howard University, when I get out of prison and I got a full tuition academic scholarship, bust my ass for that scholarship, had a baby on the way, poor as hell, full tuition scholarship. They find out I've been in prison, scholarship gone. And so, I think that I get it. Yeah, I'm first to condemn the system, but we are the system. And I think it's a way in which, like, the critique slips. You know, I had friends. My wife went to Howard, so it ain't like I hate Howard. Ethelbert Miller, one of my great mentors, went to Howard. My friends done gone to Howard. But come on, ain't nobody judging these institutions that I became a genius when I got into Yale Law School. As if the year before I wasn't a fellow at the Harvard Radcliffe Institute. Like I had to jump over every goddamn brick wall just to make people say, you know what? He ain't a felon. It was an accident. I don't know what happened, but he is a different person. And I think frequently in the need to condemn the system, we actually don't spend enough time condemning the structures that co-sign the shit the system do. Because if more people got an education in the system, if more people had access to books, then we would have to ask different kind of questions of ourselves about why we won't hire people. You know, why we won't get them opportunities. Why when they apply for an apartment, they can't get out. Or why when a dude comes home broken and can't get a job and is fucking in the street talking to himself, right? We blame it on him instead of the conditions of the system that drove him mad. And you know, and so I think, I mean, there's too many people listening for me not to say that. Like how like disgusted I am about so many of the institutions that I have come through who have made me right now. They got hiring policies at Yale that don't hire people with felonies. I was like, yo, tell them I got a job there. To somebody else who got a criminal record who's trying to get a gig that they like, I don't know if they're gonna hire me because I got a record. So I think it's like, for me, I would just be really remiss to hide how like so much of my success is a product of like just like luck, and it could have easily spent out the other way. In fact, at every opportunity, apply to law school. I don't know if we want you here because you got, you know, you're a convicted felon. What will your classmates think about your criminal record? I graduated from law school, passed the bar. I don't know if you got the character fitness to be a lawyer. Like the shit literally does not stop, and it only stops in these spaces when the invitation to me lends credence to the institution. When the invitation to me didn't lead credence to the institution, the only person, Charlene Hunter Galt, my arrogant ass, I got invited. She heard me on NPR, and they invited me to go to Harvard to be on some panel. And I'm so broke. I'm like, look, I got to get paid to do this. And she could have completely dismissed me because wasn't nobody getting paid. And she was like, all right, we'll find a little bit of money for you. I mean, one of the few people who was like in the face of like desperation and being ignored was like, let me put you on a stage that you don't deserve to be on. And so I just think it's important to, I don't know, I don't know. Maybe I'm just frustrated because it's you know, it ain't my birthday and I'm jealous right now because I want to have a party after this. But I'm happy to be celebrating Angela Davis' birthday, so I'm talking too much.
You're not talking too much. There are a couple of things that, just as Craig slowed you down a second, I want to underscore. I mean, you said something really important that we have to think about for abolition. And this is why visualizing abolition is so difficult and so important. And why part of it is just the practice of doing it. Because you are absolutely right. Our folks often co-sign all of these policies. And often when it comes to being able to advance when other people can't, we go ahead and do that. And so, you know, we are really talking about another way of living with each other. I mean, you're telling a story about having survived in prison and having been able to find ways to use your mind in ways that allowed you to end up on the other side of those walls doing this work and to continue doing this work. And for you to talk about what a challenge it is, you are precisely putting your finger on how much of a challenge it is to everyone else who hasn't been able to make that happen. And we need to think about those connections we have, and especially I think for Black folks, doubling down on these you know, policing and punishment and the grammar of success that we often use. And I think it's important that we talk about that. And I also think it's important for us to talk about, and I hope Craig will help us a little bit more. I mean, I feel like this is a very rare opportunity with this conversation to talk about what it's like inside in ways that are um, important for people to understand. Why do we think it's okay that people are made to suffer in so many uh, m- uh, small and large ways, in these petty ways, in ways that do nothing but extend this dramatic suffering? And you know, what can we do? And I'm thinking with you, Craig, what can we do? You're in a field called social psychology, and not everyone watching here today is an academic. Could you explain a little bit about what that means and why that makes a difference in the work you do and how you do it, and how that helps you show and write about what's going on inside?
Well, it's a lens through which you try to understand people's behavior as a function of the context in which they exist. Some of that context is past context, their history, their personal or social history, and some of it is the present circumstances that they confront in their day-to-day life. So when you take that lens and you turn it on a place like prison or jail or the criminal justice system, it helps you understand how people's behavior, how their emotions, how their mindset gets shaped by the nature of the environment. But it also helps you, frankly, understand how people get there in the first place. You know, I was alluding a little earlier to this sort of fiction that people just make free and autonomous choices to do good things or bad things. And you don't have to be a social psychologist to know that that's an oversimplification of anyone's life and anyone's choice of paths, which is determined by things that have happened to you in the past and things that are confronting you now in the present. And so I think, you know, it is important to understand the power of these environments to change and transform people, the power of prison environments. And, you know, Gina, you were alluding a minute ago to the issue of that kind of haunts us who do this kind of work. Why do we allow this to happen? Why do we, you know, the dehumanization, the trauma, the thing that Dwayne writes so eloquently about in his own autobiographical account of these things. And I think there is a social psychological explanation for at least some of it. And it has to do with the fact that these places are set up as secret environments. They're really, we've really created them in such a way that they are off the grid, so to speak. I mean, they're off the visual grid. You drive past them, you see them. We've been conditioned not to think about what's going on inside. Even as an academic, you can't get inside. You can't get inside to study it. I go inside because a judge tells a warden that he has to let me come inside. He doesn't want to. And if I showed up as an academic and said, gee, I'm interested in studying this, I'm curious about it, I wouldn't get past the front gate. And this kind of secrecy has kept the public consciousness safe from the reality of what's taking place inside. And then added to that, we spent 40 years profoundly demonizing the people that we put inside these places. And so not only does the public kept separate from what actually happens to people inside, but the public's been conditioned not really to care about them, because after all, they're not really part of our community, or they're fundamentally different from the rest of us. That lesson is taught again and again and again in public discourse, in media accounts of crime and punishment, in story after story, that distances us not only from the reality of what's happening inside, but from the humanity of the people who get put inside. I mean, Dwayne was talking earlier about the law's ability to decontextualize and really dehumanize, depersonalize the subjects of even legal briefs, which are designed to do good, to raise civil rights issues. But oftentimes there's no person in that story. So even the law takes the person out of it. So even the lawyers who are doing the work have to struggle to remember they're talking about people. They're talking about human being. They're not talking about section 2463, subparagraph 2. So this whole system really is set up in a way that kind of keeps us apart from one another and dehumanizes us, and then keeps hidden the worst aspects of the system.
We are absolutely prevented from seeing, and I want to talk a little bit more about that point about being an academic and what we're allowed and not allowed to see. I'll just say, I think the way I met you, Craig, decades ago, was that we made a visit to a prison together with a research group at the University of California, and as part of that research group, we were attempting to be admitted into prisons. And that means that we are asking permission of the people who run the prisons. It also comes against the presumption that you are asking to visit a prison, not because you're interested in studying the prison itself, but because you're studying prisoners. Because of course we know that researchers have been permitted to study prisoners for a very long time. And yet the modalities of studying prisoners are designed to continue to fortify the system, to turn those individual stories into stories that consolidate the notion of a prison culture, which is defined through those who are incarcerated and not by those who are holding them. And so it is really important for us to say, I think here and out loud, that we're talking about the system. And it's a system, as Dwayne was pointing out, that we are in also. It is not a system that we are on the outside of. And so one of the things in your poetry and in your work, Dwayne, that I so admire, and you've displayed it already here, but I think it's worth pointing out, is your self-critical relationship, not only to your past, but to everything you're doing. I think of that, and of course we could laugh about it if we talked about this political moment and what we've all just been through in the last years together, but a willingness to look at oneself and to think seriously about where we receive ideas and how we are made to think and to look is important for us to begin to consider. And I'm noticing some things in your background, Dwayne, that I think we want to talk about because you've been doing things continually to enliven your imagination and to continue on that journey to do more than what law school can provide you. So I wonder if you could share a little bit about what's behind you.
Yeah, I'll read a poem to introduce it first. The poem is called Essay on Reentry. It's about a friend of mine named Roger Fentress. We met in 1997. He was in a cell adjacent to mine. He got sentenced to 53 years for murder. He swore he didn't do it, and he said, "Look, I didn't do it." And we was like, "Yeah, ain't none of us do it." He was like, "Nah, for real, man, I ain't do it." Judge offered me 20 years. I said, "Nah." He offered me 12 years. I said, "Nah." He offered me 9 years. I said, "Nah." He offered me 5. I said, "No," because I wasn't gonna plead guilty to killing somebody that I ain't killed. But they gave him 53 years. We was in Virginia, and at the time, Virginia had just gotten rid of parole because citizens demanded it. And I say it's funny because they just brought back parole for juveniles. It took 25 years for it to happen, and it only happened because for the first time in a quarter century, the Democrats controlled the Virginia legislature. So voting matters and all that good stuff. But I'll read the poem because it features him. And the thing about the poem, I hate explaining my poems, but I just want to say this one thing is like he was writing me a letter. He had a point in the poem where like I was dejected. I thought he was saying one thing and he still had this sort of profound sense of hope. And I realized that I had slipped into the trap of despair, and I was free. And I realized that I had a despair that I ain't have a right to own, especially because he had 53 years and he ain't have it. So point is that Fat Saint never killed nobody, but has known more years in cells than cities, than school, than lovers, than his favorite cousin lived, more years than freedom. We met before B ran his time up over a 5-inch black and white, before K broke somebody's jaw with the lock in the sock, back when everyone thought they'd go home, before T went home and was murdered, before J went home and came back. He gave me the mad for men I did my bid with. Yesterday, I sat at a table with Star. Remember him? I was looking at his balding head, and he was looking at the grays that cover my crown. I looked at Juvie at a nearby table, both crown and beard stubble completely gray. We first discovered cells decades ago as teenagers, and just today a mirror reminded me of my disappearing self. Androgenic alopecia, a word for our vanishing hair. Latin describing how time will cause everything to recede. No word exists for the years that we've lost to prison. And I thought, Fats describing a moment he shared with men he's known for a score of years in prison, was thinking about all that loss. But he writes, looking at the landscape of gray that had become them, he realized it was far from over. Because all these rounds later, prison ain't still undefeated. And one of these days, we might find us some free. And so it was wild because I was working on a redaction project and I'm writing all these poems about prison and my homeboys. I'm dedicated a book to them. And I wanted them to have a representation in the outside world beyond the words that I borrowed from them in the poems that I sung for them, right? So I got them to send me their clothes. They sent me, sweatpants, and it's history in it, Take a pair of sweatpants like this, they got holes in it, you know, things went from what you would wear on the yard to look good to what you would sleep in to what you would work out in. And now they sent me that stuff and I chopped it up into little small pieces and I was working with a paper maker and we made this paper, as part of the show. I was gonna label that shit $3.7 million or 127 years. Either the amount of time the guys who sent it to me had done in prison or the amount of money it cost to keep them locked up. Trying to find somebody to buy it. And decided against it unless they give me the money. And I really got to set it on fire in the middle of a courtyard to prove a point. But I did that, right? And it was crazy because started all of this shit and all these dudes I knew was still locked up. And then people started asking me to represent them. And I started representing my homeboys and uh, losing parole hearing, parole hearing, parole hearing. And then finally I got my man Juvie out. Fats got free too. He got a pardon. I got my man Luke out. And so in the past year, I got 4 people out of prison in various ways, 1 pardon, 3 parole. And I'm still representing folks. And so I wanted the paper to do something else, I had this stack of prison paper, and the prison paper just represented the incarceration. And honestly, I made it not really believing they would be free. You go through the steps because you're supposed to go through the steps. So I show up in front of the parole board to represent folks, not because I actually think that they'll get out, because like it's my fucking job, like and it's arguing for somebody who I did time with, who I like ate a meal with in a rec yard, who like I almost like stomped somebody head into the ground with, all kinds of random shit. And but these dudes end up free. And Juvie was my man, and he got out in May. You know, came home middle of a pandemic, and he died in December. And it fucked me up because you're not supposed to die when you're 43. I mean, unless you're a black man, then shit, every option is open. But it fucked me up because you lived 26 years in prison and you come home and you die before I introduce you to good whiskey. I mean, it's something just brutal. And then it's no funeral.
Mm.
And so I shipped all of this prison paper I had and I shipped it to Japan and I turned it into these kites, these squares. And the shit is like it's unbelievable because I sent it to this paper maker who I sent it to this artist, this Japanese artist who works with handmade paper. She takes it and she floats things onto the paper. And so like this Japanese paper is from the 11th century. It's actually business records. But the idea is like, how do you bring life to an object by recycling things that people thought was no longer needed? And I sent her stacks of paper, friends' paper, and like even and it's stacks of letters that my friends wrote me. Because I was trying to figure out how do I make it have more of their life and grant some kind of freedom that we still chasing. And so all of these squares have like fragments of letters in it. And the idea is that I don't know, man. I don't know what the idea is. It's the best elegy I got right now. So that's what it is.
Thank you so much. We're starting to get questions, and I want to read one from our own Jennifer Gonzalez, who is was introduced earlier as the faculty co-chair, co-director of the institute that's hosting us tonight. And I'm going to read it. It's for Dwayne, and I think it's a response to what you just shared. Your poetry reads across the body in the way that prisons move across bodies, marking them, barring them, covering them, blocking them. The visible words open a space, airspace, in the redacted documents. In these powerful artworks, it is the words rather than the drawings that let us see. Would you like to say more about this?
Um, yeah, well, I would say thank you. And I would say, I think, I like to think it's both. I mean, I like to think that, if you think about, I like to think it's both. I like to think that if you get close to the artwork, I mean, it actually is it's something that happens. It's almost frightening. You look at the eyes, and some of them are adamant about, demanding freedom, and some of the eyes are weary, and some of them are frightened. And I think, all great art tries to do more than one thing. And I like to think, when we did this at MoMA at PS1, and you could see, like nearly all of the pieces laid out on the wall. I mean, it was something. It was something frightening. And the words were powerful. I mean, this cat was in there who was blind. He was
Mm,
like, he was like, man, I wish I could just hear the words. And I was like, oh shit, I've recorded them for you. Just come here, come in, come here, sit down. And we sat him down and put the headphones on him. And the words do something. Um,
mm,
but it was the combination because then his folks would describe the images and describe how the
mhm,
words were produced. And so I think it's both. But I appreciate the compliment. And I like to think more than moving through the body, I think they come out of the body.
mm.
I think they come out of a, you know, so I don't know, some kind of wild desperation.
I'm thinking with Craig now. I'm just looking, and you ended by talking about coming out of wild desperation, and I mean that's what we know that many people are dealing with inside. Uh, Craig, could you talk a little bit more about what happens to people in especially solitary, but in all the institutions that you've been in, and maybe I know this is asking for something pretty horrifying to talk about, but maybe some of the strategies that have allowed people to begin to make an art of survival. And what happens to the mind? What happens through segregation?
Well, I Jennifer's question talked about the way in which prison constrict and constrains the body, and of course it constricts and constrains the mind as well, maybe as powerfully, if not more so. And in solitary confinement, the people that I work with tell me that maintaining their sanity is a constant struggle. It's a constant challenge. That that it, this is an environment in which you're each moment of each day you're at risk of gazing into the void and not knowing if you're going to be swallowed up by it, or if you can maintain your coherence, your coherence as a person, your sense of self, your values, your ability to connect to other people. And so, not surprisingly, solitary confinement, particularly prison in general, but solitary confinement in particular, predisposes people to depression. These are grim environments to be in. Dwayne told us a few minutes ago that books are contraband. Most everything else is contraband in these environments as well. And so people in solitary confinement not only become depressed, but oftentimes they begin, and this is the holding on to sanity part of it, begin to lose a grasp of who they are and what they are in the world, or if they are in the world. So I've had people tell me that they provoked fights, provoked confrontations with the staff which they know will lead to them being physically abused. That's what a confrontation precipitates in a solitary confinement unit. You don't give your tray back. You refuse an order, and you're in solitary confinement, and you're going to get cell extracted. That's the euphemistic term for having the SWAT team come and physically pull you out of your cell, and oftentimes beat you in the process. And I've had men tell me that they provoke this in order to convince themselves that they still exist in the world, that they can still provoke a response from the outside world, because nothing else about their environment is evidence of that. It's proof of existence that they, a kind of ontological desperation. So those are the extremes of it, and then there are other creative devices that people use to try to maintain social relationships. Solitary confinement, the essence of that, of course, is the deprivation of meaningful human social contact, meaningful touch. I've had people tell me that they set up photographs of their family on their bunk, and in units where they can have a television, they watch television, they watch sporting events with their family, by which they mean the pictures of their children sitting on their bunk alongside of them, and actually engage them in conversation as if they were actually having this kind of an event that they once had with their families. And on it goes. I mean, you create some kind of meaningful existence out of an environment that is hell-bent on depriving you of those kinds of opportunities. And, as Dwayne was saying earlier, not everybody survives it. And even people who do come out of it with long memories. Again, we had Albert Woodfox on our campus a couple of years ago, and Albert, holds one of the world's records for longest amounts of time in solitary confinement. Wrote a book that was nominated for a Pulitzer Prize, and Albert will be the first person to tell you that his post-prison survival has brought with it a long memory. That this is not something you put behind you easily, no matter how successful you appear to be, and no matter how much you're able to achieve, and admirably so. But these things stay with you, even when you come out and you're intact.
Yeah, we do have, it's bleak to hear the descriptions, and it's important for us to hear them. And it's also important, I know, as usual, many people are watching this, maybe who've never thought about these issues. And one of the issues that comes up is, well, what else are we to do with all of the terrible people? And I don't really want you to answer that. I just want us to realize that we always get this question, and it doesn't allow us to think about really how we are participating in the structures that are doing these terrible things. I think
Yeah,
we've got to be able to balance those things.
but
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm pretty certain that I said at least 26 minutes ago that I carjacked somebody. Like, I literally did not say that I was incarcerated for a non-serious thing. And so what happens is, even and I respect the question, but the question was asked, but the person put blinders on the literal thing I said. I mean, unless you say that the person doesn't know what carjacking is, and I can respect that too. But I said I went to prison at 16, which doesn't sound like I did a non-serious thing to get put in an adult penitentiary at 16. And my friends have committed murders. I'm representing somebody now that has a body. I've gotten people out of prison who have committed murders. And it ain't even for me to repeat the trite notion that you aren't the worst thing that you've done. It's to argue that when I go in front of the parole board. Now, before I go in front of the parole board, when me and the person that I'm representing dumping hours of pro bono work as if I ain't got a full-time job, and to figuring out how to tell a narrative about their life that's more than just a pistol, we go deep, and it is frustrating, and it is painful, and people confront like things that they've done. I mean, it's not as if we walk into this world and we say, oh yeah, you put a pistol to somebody's head, but shit just happens, you should always be free. That is not what happens. And I think the question demeans all of the work that people do in their own personal lives to confront the harm that they cause. I mean, there's books out there, it's things that have been written. I wrote a book. That question on the surface, you know, belies the work that has been done to answer it already. That question has been answered. And fundamentally, like the Jeffrey Dahmers, I'm gonna tell you, I know people that's far more frightening than Jeffrey Dahmer, and a lot of them got police badges. You know what I mean? Like we don't need to invent the boogeyman. The real question is, what are we doing in our name to people who don't nearly meet that metric? And most people in prison don't meet that metric, even when they've committed a violent crime. That name in Jeffrey Dahmer it's just like a rhetorical trick that is not even that sophisticated. And it's not that it's a dumb question. It's a question that invites us to ask, do you actually care about the answer? Because it is far too much work out there. Anybody who knows me knows that I have never in my life acted like I didn't put a pistol to somebody's head. And I understand the weight that comes with that. I just wrote a piece about somebody raping my mom. Like, this is an absurdity. The question itself is an absurdity. And I don't have to, I am dignifying it with a response, but the reason is because it matters. If the person who asked the question really believes this is important, read the piece I wrote about Kamala Harris. Read Angela Davis's work. This is not, we haven't walked into a room as if we don't know the harm that people cause. These letters are about their harm. My whole life is about their harm. My son saying, my life is different because I'm the only, peer who has to talk about the fact that his dad went to prison for robbing somebody. Like, all of those things are real, and nobody is running from those things. I'm never going to get invited back here again. I am so sorry.
Actually, I was going to thank you for not only answering it, but for um, answering it with complexity. And I think that's really what we're trying to encourage always with this. It's become possible to say abolition now in ways that it wasn't possible just recently, fairly recently. But it's also possible to avoid talking about all the difficulties. And I think you've helped us to see the violences on both sides. I mean, we could spend a long time talking about what the definition of violence is that is used to incarcerate, which violences are observed and legally codified, which violences are, Craig made a point a moment ago about someone inside refusing to turn in a tray. I mean, the way that behaviors get framed as violations, especially inside, but also in the free world, when we think about so many instances of police violence, this we know. I think it is also important for us to recognize that we have a mediatic environment, an environment of a visual world, of a world of representation that has made it possible to ask, as you pointed out, Dwayne, that question again and again, even in the presence of all kinds of evidence and conversation that doesn't necessarily speak in naive or dishonest terms about other things that have occurred. So, I really want us to move toward an end on a note where we can actually talk about what we're building. And I'm going to use a question that came in to go back to your paper that you shared with us and the kites that you shared with us behind you, Dwayne. And you have a question from someone named Willow who says, Dwayne, when you turned prison paper into kites, were you thinking about the kites people use inside to communicate, share reading materials, etc.? And then a comment, that art is powerful, beautiful elegy. And I wonder if you could just answer that and also help us to think about what we might be
Yeah.
flying.
Yeah, thank you. No, I think both. I was thinking about, language is beautiful in that the word that they use for note in prison is a kite, and this is just like slang that dudes made up. Just like, yo, send them a kite. Send them this magical impossibility. Who in the hell thought that you could put some paper on a string 100 feet long and fly it into the sky as if you are a bird? It is just something beautiful about that image and about that metaphor. And to know that I discovered it in one of the worst places you could ever be is something that I hold with me. Um, so yeah, that's what I meant. And I will say every single person that I represented outside of Feds was guilty. And for each one of them, we went in front of a parole board and talked about how they had done too much time, but however you shake it out, they had done enough. And in every single one of those conversations, we talked about violence. And my friends have, talking to victims' rights advocates. They've talking to other people. All of them have have been victims of crimes themselves. And I think about that piece right there. When I made the paper, I was trying to do some artistic shit. And then in the process of making the paper, I began working really hard to get them free. And I think on the paper became a kite when freedom became the mission more than art.
Beautiful. I wanted to pause on that because you've put so beautifully what I hope we can do by talking together and by continuing to make space for these conversations in an environment where it's very difficult to have them without all of the noise around. I wonder, Craig, if you wanted to um, say a little, since I asked you to talk about the horrors of solitary and of prison in general. If you could talk about the ways that we can all work to help others to um, not only, I guess, survive, but to thrive, and what lessons you feel like your work has for thinking with arts today.
Well, Dwayne said something in passing a few minutes ago that I think he referred to it as a trite observation that all of us are more than the worst things that we've ever done. Um, I think it's also the case. There's a companion observation to that, that those worst things also have a context and a set of explanations or reasons associated with them, whatever the worst things are. And what prison and the criminal justice system more generally allows us as a society to do is to conveniently ignore that context and those reasons and those explanations and causes. And it acts as though those that context, the things that cause these worst things that all of us do, is irrelevant. That the only thing that matters is the person and doing something to the person. So I think it's important as we try to visualize abolition to think about what purpose prison serves in this society. This is an institution that's been around for more than 200 years. It's almost unchanged from the day it was invented, actually. It's one of the few institutions in our society that looks pretty much now like it looked in 1820. So it must be serving some purpose. And a useful thing, I think, for all of us to do is reflect on what purpose that is that it's serving. It's certainly not serving the purpose that we as a society claim it's serving. It's serving some other underlying purpose. I think a sobering thing to contemplate. So what to do instead? Well, certainly we need to change that institution as radically as we can to alleviate the pain and suffering that it imposes on people, in addition to imprisonment per se. Gina, you said people are supposed to go to prison as punishment, not for punishment. So the for punishment, gratuitous aspects of that institution need to be radically reformed. But in addition, I think we need to look at the context and the reasons and the societal forces that are creating what we've learned to define as the social problem of crime. That's where our energy should be put. Um, transforming this society so that it deals with people in a caring and humane way. Prison really isn't part of that formula, and we need to move as rapidly as a society as we can to create something different and better and more humane and more human.
Well, I want to thank you both for a beautiful afternoon. And I want to thank you, Dwayne, for surviving and thriving to the extent that you can share this beauty with us. Craig, I want to thank you for your wisdom tonight and also your decades of dedication to this work before most people wanted to hear about it. And I also want to have us close by watching together this amazing video that was sent to us by the artist and actor and musician Malcolm Jamal Warner, who created a video precisely about this problem. And I look forward to seeing you all again in the free world. And the
How do we imagine justice? Imagine justice. How do we imagine justice? Imagine justice. Imagine justice. How do we imagine justice?
In a very different context, justice that's not based on vengeance.
You can almost choke on the strange, seductive smoke evoked by lies the mirror hides. The sleight of hand fans the flames of deception, singeing the truth in the cleverest of fashion, and then sold as baked goods, apple pie sweet, just enough to pamper a pauper's palate. And we feast fast because we've got that human hunger, soul starved, spirit searching to be fed anything that feels good. And truth be told, lies feel good, right? Like a cherry tree myth. And America's lies, seasoned with cunning deceit and sauteed with just enough arrogance to be addictive, make us feel good about ourselves as we lead the world of the free. So we lead with an incarcerated count of 2.3 million. That's more bars than Tariq Trotter, styling free on that Calvin Broadus weed. Caught up in a Deepak Chopra type flow. America knows how this fascinating infatuation goes with seeing those we deem guilty suffer. Strange fruit hung, black bodies swung in service of great white lies. Dripping blood, spectating eyes could never see seep into the soil of our conflicted humanity. Notice how we respond quicker to justice, real or perceived, much quicker than we are soothed by the scattered seeds of restoration. I mean, sure, at its core, we believe in rehabilitation, but as a society, really, we believe in punishment more. So we fool ourselves into believing that prisons are built to be a place where bad apples get restored. That the same prison system put in place to enslave post-Civil War is supposed to promote progress in healing whatever harms put people within arm's reach of the unfortunate side of the law. Where wounds reopen, scabs get ripped raw, rights stripped, tight-lipped screams, tight ship means freedom only belongs to the daringest of dreamers. Prison is where the dope and dopamine addicts go to get treated by being mistreated. Repeatedly defeated by a system that tries to rehabilitate a life of crime while at the same time breeds it. When the prison pipeline is hungry, the courts and even schools feed it. Gourmet, flambe, however the system needs it. Oh, how privatization savors the flavor of cheap prison labor. Reclaimed, roasted slave trade tossed in the mush of unrefined modern-day meat sauce. While we continue to bear the cost of a broken system the DOC can't even correct. The required steps for true transformation hardly get met. The concept of restorative justice becomes one of neglect. And recidivism is where private prisons collect on their hedge bets. So, how can we expect re-entry into society by the incarcerated who've been deprived of their dignity, disenfranchised, cast aside, and expect them to live normal lives when gainful employment is as elusive as Lady Justice's blind eye? The justice system is broken and sick, and as in need of rehabilitation as the citizens it fails to rehabilitate. So imagine if there was more stake in taking stock of society's symptoms before the sickness set in, and we cared more about prevention than vengeful, vindictive detention. You know, imagine instead of a punishment band, we aid in healing the ills of education, and we took a stand against the economic inequity upon which our country runs. Reallocate funds to create a society where self-love suffices. Eradicate all societal vices. And in the end, we all win. Imagine that. Imagine that. But can you imagine that?
And how do we imagine justice and imagine justice and imagine justice in a very different context? Justice that's not based on vengeance, but justice that's made on repairing the relationships that are damaged through harm. It's a long-term plan, obviously. Very long-term plan. Very long-term.
But can you imagine that? But can you imagine that?